Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Adams, and I'm the editor-in-chief with the Signature Leadership Series from Knowledge Hook, and really excited to have you here with us for the SEL Global Leadership Series. Our topic today is going to be social emotional learning, a curriculum for change. And just before we get started, I wanted to introduce you to the three sponsors for this series. The first one is Karanga. Karanga is the Global Alliance for Social Emotional Learning and Life Skills. We do work in the area of advocacy, connecting communities, implementation support, and cutting edge research. And we're really excited to be part of this. Our second sponsor is Salzburg Global Seminar, and Salzburg Global Seminar is an international nonprofit that came into being just after the Second World War. They do an incredible job with helping to support current and future leaders, really trying to make the world a better place. Happy to have them as part of this. And finally, Knowledge Hook is a Canadian digital math company, and they're very interested in promoting thought leadership for senior education leaders and school education leaders. This portal is available to all of you. All of the resources are free, and you're welcome to sign up at knowledgehook.com/leadership. Today, we are really happy to be able to say that we've got registrants from 7 Canadian provinces, from 23 US states, and from 21 countries. And again, social emotional learning is obviously a topic that is global in nature. We have interest from right around the world, and really excited to be able to share with you the incredible panelists that we'll have today. So our day will be hosted by Dominic Regester, and he is an amazing friend and colleague. He's the program director at Salzburg Global Seminar in Salzburg, Austria, and he is a fellow executive member from Karanga. Dominic has great experience in hosting these types of events, and I'm going to pass it over to Dominic to introduce our incredible panelists, Tony Jackson and Leonor Yapich. Over to you, Dominic.
Thanks, Jennifer, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the SEL Global Leadership Series in April, a curriculum for change. Things have to change. One of the great takeaways from 2020, this remarkable year of convergent crises, is that a lot of reflection on what needs to change, how we live our lives, how we treat the planet, how we treat one another, have all been brought into stark relief by major events throughout the course of the last 12 months. Education is a key part of the change that many of us connected with this series, and I imagine many people who are joining the call are very interested in bringing about. We've got two amazing speakers joining us today, Leonor Yapich from the Montessori Group and Tony Jackson from the Asia Society. Remarkably, it's the first time the two of them have ever been in conversation in public together, which is astonishing and makes it even more exciting, I think. We're going to be exploring these three questions and many other things besides over the course of the next hour. One of the reasons that Knowledge Hook and Karanga and Salzburg Global were really interested in bringing Leonor and Tony together is because we felt there were some really interesting points of contact between things that have been cornerstones of the Montessori philosophy for education, the Montessori pedagogy for 150 years now, and a lot of the things that Tony has been writing about in the last few months about the need and the case for change. So some of the Montessori ideas around respect for one another, around the importance of living in harmony with society and in harmony with the planet, find really compelling echoes in some of Tony's recent writings around education for teaching truth to power, around education for the common good, and a really brilliant piece, Tony, that you wrote, I think the most recent piece you published, that looked at this through line connecting behaviors associated with racist mindsets, along with difficult antisocial selfish behaviors during the pandemic, along with selfish reactions to the climate crisis and the evidence around that. It's a really interesting argument developing the through lines and the commonalities that characterize those kinds of responses. So the way we're going to structure our time together is Tony's going to make an opening statement in a minute to elaborate on some of the ideas that I've just sketched over and that he's been writing and thinking about in much more depth and detail. Leonor will then respond, reflecting on what Tony said through a Montessori prism, and then we'll move into a conversation between the three of us. We would love to bring in as many questions from people watching as possible, so please feel free to put questions either in the Q&A or in the chat, and Jennifer and I between us will try and curate them and then bring them to Tony and Leonor's attention at the right moment. So Tony, if I could hand over to you to make some opening remarks, please. And thank you both very much for being with us today. I should have said that already.
No, well, thank you, Dominic. Thank you for those kind words, and also for this opportunity to talk about what is, I think, a really absolutely critically important topic, and also for the pleasure of now having a chance to chat with my new colleague, Leonor, in, as you say, public. We've had some times to talk in private, but this is a lovely opportunity to continue that discussion with colleagues around the world. I think my own thoughts on what the past 12 months have helped us understand are really much like everybody else's, which is we're trying to figure out what's going on, what's being revealed by this sort of perfect storm of disruptions coming from the pandemic, from ongoing crises caused by or exacerbated by climate change, and in the US, by the unending cycle of violence and killing, especially as it's targeted to people of color and the uprisings against that. What is going on here? Well, one of the things that has happened over the past year that we all are quite aware of is the killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. It is in its own right a horrific occurrence, but I think it reveals a lot more too about kind of our societies in general. There's a trial going on right now, but whatever the outcome of that trial is, when Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, what the video revealed, particularly in the way he stared into the video and simply kept on talking and as if nothing unusual was happening, is that not for a moment did he think he was not in full compliance with the law and the norms of our culture, a culture that sanctions, consciously or unconsciously, the dominance of white people over people of color. That's the nature of systemic racism. And what we see in that is that it's related, at least in my mind, to, as Dominic said, things like the denial of climate change. They're coming from the same root, which is a willingness to jeopardize the lives of a few, or in fact millions of human beings, to preserve an inequitable and unsustainable status quo. And sort of animating this denial for the need to change is what I've been calling the dominance mindset. The belief that there is, in the natural order of things, there are winners and losers, and that's just the way it is. There's a competing worldview that says that that's not really the case. You might think of this as the egalitarian paradigm that recognizes that people and societies, they differ in profound ways. We know that, but these differences do not require, or nor do they legitimize, dominance of one group of people over another, or for that matter, human beings over nature. Instead, in this view, the way to think about things and act towards others and the environment is to consider what's best for all and not just for a few. To consider, as Dominic said, the common good. So what I think the past year reveals that has a lot to do with the purpose of education is, quite frankly, that we're at a tipping point between systems and ways of organizing human endeavor that reflect the dominance paradigm versus an egalitarian paradigm. We've reached an inflection point, in my view, in human history and human evolution, if you will, where it becomes obvious that there are many of the systems that are now based on dominance mentality are just not working in ways that will provide a future for our children that's worth living in. And education, as broadly practiced in the United States and globally, I think is reflective of this dominance paradigm. And it is not working to produce a future for children that's worth living in. And quite frankly, in my view, no amount of systemic reform to renovate existing education systems will achieve a different outcome. We don't need more systemic reform. We need systems redesign. And we need to redesign education systems to produce in all young people a fundamental shift in mindset from this dominance mindset to a more egalitarian mindset, from an education benefiting power elites to education for the common good. So that's my sense of kind of what the past 12 months have made starkly evident, and that it calls for a change in the purpose of education from one that teaches young people to accept the legitimacy of some people having hegemony over others and for humans over nature that will ultimately lead to our demise, to an education system that teaches young people to strive for equality as the norm, not the exception, and for balance with nature. And in the articles I've written, Teaching Truth to Power, and so on, I've called this new purpose for education, education for the common good. I think you could just as easily call it education for survival. And let me just leave it at that. But I'd be very curious to have Leonor's reaction and colleagues around the world to have a dialogue all about this.
Well, thank you, Tony. I mean, I think that's a very powerful start to this conversation, and one which resonates very clearly with where we stand as Montessori. And when you were talking, I mean, I completely agree. We are at this inflection point, and you know, we just need to look at what the current education system, as you say, is not an education system that's necessarily fit for purpose now and for the future, because it was created at a time of the Industrial Revolution, where there was that dominance, where there was that inequality. And what we've done is just sort of continue to perpetuate that sort of mentality if we continue with this form of education. In Montessori, you know, we talk about the uniqueness of each child, and that uniqueness is what creates respect. So it's, you're right, we're not all the same, but that's okay. You know, it's about celebrating that uniqueness. It's about encouraging children to say, yes, this is who I am, and I am different from my friend or my teacher or my colleague or, you know, the member of my community, but that doesn't make me any better or any worse than them. It is about that sense of, you know, we are all unique. And that respect, not just for ourselves, but for each other and for the world, is a sort of very strong theme that runs through the whole of the Montessori approach. And we talk about approach rather than curriculum, because it is an approach that fits in with any culture. It is about that sort of underlying theme of we are unique, we have to encourage each child to reach its full potential, and we have to teach respect for the world around us, what Montessori called cosmic education, because we are part of a bigger world, and we have a unique part in it, but at the same time we have to respect and understand that we are part of that bigger world. And I agree, I think the last 12 months, I think people are willing to have that conversation. I think we've, you know, I think it's brought to the forefront these, you know, it is a perfect storm of actually really awful events, you know, where we've seen also, you know, in Europe and other parts of the world, you know, the rise of, you know, what they would call strongman politics, which is all about dominance. And it can be quite fearful, and I think people are questioning. And so I completely agree. And I think that I liked your idea about that, you know, what we should, that we need a systems change rather than a systemic change. I think that's absolutely right. And we need to encourage children and young people to question and be curious. So yeah, I think it was a very powerful start, and thank you for that.
Tony, because there are sort of two strands to your work, aren't there? There's the work that you do with the network of schools across the US, and then there's the work that you do around global competence education, which is for both the US and Asia. And are you finding a sort of similar positive engagement with what you're talking about across both those different school networks, or is the reaction and the need different in different geographies?
No, I mean, we haven't, I would say, found significant difference in geographies to these ideas. I mean, I think that there is literally in education just as Leonor was saying, a dawning emergence, a recognition that that, you know, what we've been doing, you know, we're getting better and better around the world at doing what we have done many years in the past. I mean, and so we're getting more young people who are able to achieve well in science and math and so forth, which is all a good thing. But but that doesn't change the fundamental paradigm of, as I would call it again, the sort of dominance mindset versus egalitarian. It all comes down to, once you learn the great science and once you develop these capacities, how do you apply it? How do you use it? Do you use it to further individual gain in individual, accumulation of wealth, individual, kind of accentuation of your own power or your power of your group? Or do you do it to make a difference in the world for a broader population? The concept of global competence that we have sort of has four key components. One is the ability to investigate the world, which is really your sort of cognitive capacities around posing problems, particularly from a global perspective, developing arguments, developing critical thinking around those arguments, and so forth. But that connects very directly to the more social emotional aspect of development, which is, we think of it as sort of being able to recognize and weigh perspectives. And we can go into more of what that is about, but that also leads very quickly to this notion of being able to communicate and collaborate across cultures with colleagues and with friends when you're younger. But then there's a very important final step, which is the take action step, which is, what do you do with all this information, and how do you understand the consequences of what you may do, not just for your own benefit, but for the benefit of the larger society. So we've built in this notion that yes, and in that context, there's lots of ways and lots of emphasis on learning important key bits of knowledge and strategies and skills, but it all comes to, how do you actually use that to formulate the way in which you act in the world, and what is your view of what's right and what's wrong? There's a values component that goes with it. So I just think that that's being universally recognized in education broadly, and there is this sort of tension, I think, about kind of continuing and making better the system we have now versus, wait a minute, let's stop for a second. Are we really on the right path in a fundamental sense? And if not, how do we change that? And that's what I meant about systems redesign versus systemic reform.
I think that there's something in, I think you're right. I think across the, we work in 94 countries across the world, and we're getting the same concern and anxiety across the board of saying, what, not just people thinking, oh, the old system is broken, or we have to change the old system, but asking that, what can we do? What's next? I think there's a real hunger and curiosity to a need for guidance for people to understand what can they do. And we do a lot of work, obviously, with younger children, with in schools, with practical activities. We offer activities, free online activities for parents as well to do with their children, to build in some of the skills that we're talking about. And I think there is, I agree, I think there's a real hunger now for that change. And what I'm very cheered by and feel optimistic about is that, 10 years ago, I was complaining that I don't see, where are the young voices in this? Where are the young people? And now we're seeing those young people. And I think that actually does give me hope for the future, that there is, a lot of young voices around some of the, we've seen this in the US, we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in other parts of the world, actually young voices talking about, climate change, demanding change in legislation, changing in how we behave as a society. And I think that's a cause for optimism. But I think it's incumbent on us to actually be supportive of those voices, but also say, here are some paths that you can follow, and here are some ways in which you can actually change that paradigm. I don't know, Tony, if you would agree with that.
Absolutely. I think you've hit it on the head, in the sense that I think we have to recognize in education, we want to change the world, but quite frankly, and I speak from someone who's of a certain age, we didn't do it, and we haven't done it, and quite frankly, our generation, certainly my generation, is not going to be the one that changes the world. We can do everything we can, but the means by which we can change the world is through creating young people who can be activists and have the capacity and the mindset to change the world. And so their agency isn't really just a matter of, and you're not saying this, but it isn't just a matter of, it's a good outcome of education. It is the means by which we actually save the planet. So that's why education is so critical. It is the means by which we actually ensure our own survival as a species. And so now I think we've reached the point where we realize if we don't get this right, if the next generation doesn't change the way fundamentally in which we interact with each other as human beings or the way we interact with nature, then the game is beginning to tip towards we don't have another shot at it. So I just think that notion of agency is really critical, and that's why ultimately I think what we're trying to do is create players and not bystanders, kids who actually are in the game for the common good and are going to lead the charge. And I think it's critical.
Yeah. I mean, we talk very much in Montessori about the child as the agent of change, and I think that's absolutely right. And in the sense of, my generation haven't done it. We can provide, support and as you say, and tools and a framework, but it isn't going to be us that does it. But what we can do is allow those voices to be heard, and that is something that certainly I have as a concern. In that our education systems, or traditional education systems, don't often give children that voice, or it's sort of, and it's what you were talking about earlier, Tony, about that dominance of no, you don't do that, you don't say that, how dare you, sort of question, and we need that. That's something we can do. We can say no, actually we're going to give you a voice. We are going to listen.
One of the things that I was particularly interested in what Leonor was saying is it runs to the issue of so what is the nature of the preparation that we that is required to actually have this kind of have this generation of young people who have this sense of activism, and particularly speaking as a person of color, how central it is to have a deep knowledge of oneself and evaluation of oneself. So I'd love to hear a little bit more, Delma, if I could take the role of questioner away from you for a second, to know more from you, Leonor, about like how do you get at this rootedness in culture and ethnicity as a fundamental aspect of kind of how kids define themselves and the base from which they operate. I'd love to know more about that.
Well, I mean, certainly in Montessori, as I said, we look at each child as an individual, and we, teach about uniqueness, and that means understanding who you are, understanding, where you come from, who is your family, who is your community, what is the culture around you. But at the same time, understand that there are other cultures. We do a huge amount of activities around different cultures, about understanding that, that difference exists, and that's fine, and respecting that difference. So we encourage children to question that. We encourage dialogue. I mean, one of the things that some people don't know about Montessori is, for example, when there is a conflict in the classroom, or then there are stereotypes that arise that are unhelpful, because children do sometimes pick up things from outside of school or outside of the family, things they hear on TV or whatever. Then those things get discussed, and we have what we call a peace table, where we actually sit down with the children and sit down and say, well, let's explore this. Why do you have that, conversation? Why did you say that? Where does that come from? It's about allowing the child to reach that knowledge of why that may not be the right thing. We don't say to children, oh, no, you mustn't say that. What we say is, no, let's discuss this. Do you understand what you saying that? How does that make the other person feel? How does it make you feel? So there's a real sort of focus on that kind of, yes, you have to talk about things and dialogue and that conversation. Then I think, sometimes, well, I we see lacking in older people where there isn't that dialogue and that conversation and that
let's try peace tables around
it. we need a lot more peace tables, exactly. And I think that sort of ability to understand, yes, this is who I am, and a sense of self-respect for who I am, but also a respect for who that other person is. Because as much, and so when we talk about uniqueness, it's not in, oh, I'm unique and therefore I'm special and you're not. It's I'm unique, but so is the other person, and therefore we have to respect, you know, who that other person is, you know. And I think that through that conversation, through that understanding, through that, you know, there's no judgment. There isn't something that says, oh, this is, you know, this is better than that, you know, or this is, you know, you should do things this way because it's better. We don't talk about that. We allow the child to explore and learn. And I think that really is important. I mean, I think we you know, I'm always humbled when I see children, particularly young children, how they interact with each other. And you think, gosh, you know, where along the line did we lose that as we grew older, that we're not able to have these open, respectful conversations and empathy. And, you know, when we talk about these sort of, you know, what I would call essential life skills, you know, empathy, you know, and empathy, I think, is about understanding where that other person comes from. You don't always have to agree with someone, but you can respect and have empathy for their position. And I think that's something that we seem to be lacking a little bit as adults, and you see children almost comes a little bit more natural to them.
Barack Obama talked about the empathy deficit probably more than 10 years ago now, in the context of, I think, one of the mass school shootings in the US, and saw the lack of empathy as a kind of root cause to that kind of social ill. I'm really interested in what you're saying about empathy development. I wondered, are there any comparative studies in terms of empathy acquisition for students who've been through a Montessori approach and students who hadn't?
There isn't, but it's very interesting because we are going to sort of carry out, you know, research into outcomes of Montessori through our new International Montessori Institute in the UK. Because I think it's really important, and I think it's what I've been very, you know, I've been CEO of Montessori for 3 years now, and what I was very struck by when I first joined was that, you know, people I would talk about, because I've always had this belief about these essential life skills, and I would talk about it, and people would say, oh yes, but, you know, how do you measure that? How do you measure it? Well, first of all, do we have to measure it? I mean, surely, you know, isn't you know, the outcome that we actually will live a happier life and a better life if we all sort of behave differently. But even so, I think that there's an issue around, and I think that's a big issue around this topic. In yes, we need to sort of somehow meet those needs of, we must measure and we must sort of pass all this on something that actually isn't necessarily that quantifiable. I don't know.
We had Andreas Schleicher as a guest on this series last summer, and he was talking about something very similar, you know, in that we've fallen into this trap of only valuing what we measure, or only, I think he had the kind of treasure measure formulation, and actually there's many things that are more important. And I think it's really interesting at the point that we were talking with Andreas, you know, it was a kind of moment within the kind of education disruption that the pandemic had caused, when it felt like there was much more attention being given to social and emotional learning or empathy development, or rethinking the kind of fundamental purpose of education beyond, you know, standardized testing and, you know, kind of competitive acquisition of qualifications. And then it felt like that, you know, as schools reopened around the world in the autumn, that the focus on that waned slightly, and, you know, there was more of a kind of focus on learning loss and trying to recover learning. But I wonder, you know, for both of you, whether you think that, you know, this moment in time, because of the experiences of 2020 and all of the disruption that the pandemic caused, and everything that we've learned from the last 12 months, whether there is a real opportunity now to push through the kind of reform that you're both talking about. Tony, maybe we come to you.
I mean, I absolutely do. I absolutely do think, as you said, Dominic, that there is an opening of caused by kind of this disruption that people are going to fill. There's an opening in thinking, and I think, frankly, what will happen is some will fill it with the same old stuff before, but there are others who will seize the opportunity. And there are school districts around that are doing, you know, just that. we happen to have another major program called the Global Cities Education Network, which is a network in this instance of school districts, leadership teams from school districts. And we'll be meeting virtually in a couple of weeks in Surrey, British Columbia, which you probably, Jennifer perhaps knows well, but this is a district that basically has been on a very progressive, kind of trajectory, journey. And they are thoughtful about the fact that it would be a real disservice to go back simply to the way things were. And then how do you actually incorporate what we've learned about online learning and incorporate what we've learned about the value and relationship of education and schooling to kids and their families, to really craft a new way of interacting with kids and families going forward. That is a hybrid of some better use of technology, but also sort of doubling down on some of the more critical aspects of meaning making that they want kids to engage in. So I think some will and some won't. But I do think though that we have to recognize that that the enemy of change isn't a willingness or an excitement about not changing. It's inertia. It's just sort of, we will fall back into the same routines as opposed to, adamantly go, let's go back to the regressive ways we used to engage in. It's more like, well, we're just going to kind of go back to, and that's what I worry a little bit about, people worrying so much about learning loss. I mean, it's absolutely critical, but that's not the point, if there is one, of the pandemic. It is telling us, the world is changing, and we need to change significantly to be able to sort of keep up with the way in which the world is changing, and going back to a reverence for, testing and so forth is just really going to put us in a bad strait.
I completely agree, Tony, and I would say that, unfortunately, this is what happens, that it's that doing the right thing is a lot harder. It's much more hard work than doing the easy thing, and so people will go for the easy thing, which often tends to be the stuff that you've already know about and you've done, even though it's not necessarily the right thing to do. And I do worry about this whole testing thing. And it's quite interesting. We did some research in the UK of parents, and what I found really fascinating was I think it was 87% of, we polled like about 1,000 parents across all different socioeconomic backgrounds, regions in the UK, not Montessori parents. We specifically didn't want Montessori parents. And 87% of them said that the most important thing that they wanted their child to learn was kindness. Above maths, above English, above anything else, kindness. And so I think parents get it. But then, of course, you get, the media, politicians talking about, children are going to be behind on exams. Every child is in the same space. This is a global pandemic. There is no child that is necessarily not going to be affected in some way. Of course, if you've got the resources, you're less affected than those that don't. But having said that, it then makes parents panic. Oh my God, my child's not going to do their exams. Well, okay, but what have they learned? What have they learned while they've been with you? We did actually, again, we did a poll of children, and children said what they really loved doing was that they had the chance to do new things. So here are children and parents telling us, we want change, we want to do something different. And then, as you say, the inertia, that the pressure on, but we must do that. And I don't understand where that pressure is coming from, because I know that as an employer, and I know lots of employers, what we're looking for are people that have those skills of being able to be creative, far more than, nobody has ever asked me to present my university, degree certificate when I go for a job or whatever, or what grades did I get, when I was 18. But people have asked me about my experience, about how do I tackle certain things. That's what we're looking for. So it's sort of, I find it quite interesting. Where does this pressure come from? Who's putting this pressure that makes people feel suddenly we've got to go down this route of, you're worth this because you've got, this number on an exam you took, rather than you're worth this because actually you're a decent human being who's making a difference to the world.
Yeah.
And have you started to, sorry, Tony, excuse me.
Just quickly, I think part of what I was saying is that there is a reverence for the past and going back to old ways, because, at least from a psychological perspective, because the world moved along in an orderly fashion with that set of things in place. And yes, I think people will recognize that, that it's not going in the right place, but it's not chaos. And I think what people fear is taking off those things that sort of keep the systems in place, because then they don't know what's going to happen afterwards. And there's a sort of a fear of chaos and fear of not knowing how to keep things moving in an orderly fashion, that says, well, wait a minute, before let's just stick with what we've got, because I mean, at least it keeps the trains coming moderately close to being on time. When the alternative of thinking about, I don't know if the trains are going to get here on time, is a much more scary proposition. So I think we just have to get over the psychological hurdle of realizing that it's just as likely that you can figure out something that's better if you allow yourself to do that, versus simply relying on the past is sacred.
So I think that sort of circles back to your opening remarks, Tony, about dominance within education systems, that the past wasn't chaotic for the people who had positions of power in the system or in society, but for many, many other people, it is a much more fragile existence, isn't it, or a more chaotic?
Yeah. I mean, when I say education systems are broken and can't be fixed, for many people, though, I mean, your point is that it's actually working just fine. I mean, it's reproducing the systems of power and privilege that many people who are at the top are very happy with. And the sort of tragic irony in the United States is that the belief in that system of privilege and power that from people who actually hold it, they've basically, in my view, sort of sold a bill of goods to those who don't, but who look like them, to say, well, we want to continue to maintain our privilege and power, which in fact they don't even have. And I'm talking about, the insurrectionists, for example, in the Capitol. I mean, that is basically, in my view, an example of an overt and kind of violent attempt to maintain white supremacy by folks who basically are not really in positions of privilege and power, but they look like the folks who do, who are. And so it's like it's a to me a giant shell game, a con that has been bought by folks as if they were actually the people who are in privilege and power. That's a different story, but it's part of the story. Yeah.
Can I bring in some questions to come from the chat? What your conversation has been sparking. Absolutely phenomenal number of questions. Start with a couple of macro questions, please, from earlier in the conversation. So the first one, can education change, in your opinion, happen in isolation from economic and political change? And how do we influence that wider societal shift, starting with education reform? Kick off with a small question.
Well, I would say that Montessori is an example of that, because Montessori has, for almost a decade, or sort of almost a century, sat outside what we would call mainstream education, and actually, and it's still there, and it's been very successful, and and so I think that there's a possibility, and I think almost. I think always political change and economic change lags behind change at a sort of grassroots societal level. And I think it's once that you start creating, and I think education has to come first, is because if you create a generation of children who are prepared to think differently, they're the ones that are going to create that societal and political change, because they're not going to accept a society that works in the way that it appears to work. But it takes a long time to make. We know this. I mean, I often say this. Just looking at sort of equal pay, for example, for women. Maria Montessori first spoke about equal pay for women in 1896 at the first Congress, International Congress for Women's Rights. We're still debating this, in 2021. Unfortunately, it takes a very, very long time to shift, but it has to start with that education system of getting people to think differently and being encouraged and to develop their thinking. And you know, education is lifelong. It's not just, you know, when you're at school.
Yeah.
It's about always learning, always having that curiosity, always questioning. That's how you create, you know, change, by questioning the status quo. Why does that happen? Why are we allowing this to happen? What can we do differently? And it's that questioning that I think is, you know, that developing that curiosity is an essential part of education.
Do you
Tony, I don't
ever...
know.
No, I mean, I agree, and I just want to emphasize what Leonor is saying around, you know, what we do in education. We often think of it as sort of developing knowledge, but what ultimately what we're doing is developing ways of thinking. And if you had a sort of giant sort of societal theory of change, the driver that would make the most difference is the way people think. And the way in which you change people think is through learning. And the means by which we affect learning are through education systems. So you see the sort of primacy of education as the driver of that which will enable the rest of society to ultimately change. Now, obviously, that's, you know, we're all educators here, so it seems like we're the most important thing. But I mean, I think logically, there's a argument that says that, you know, education of young children, particularly and young children starting out in Montessori years and so forth. I know it goes through up to secondary school, but, you know, thinking very about young children and having them think differently about the world, bring that to the world as they enter into the economic systems. That's how we're going to really change things.
And history teaches us this. You know, if you look at history, if you look at the, you know, shifts begin when, you know, people begin to read. When more people begin to read, and you start to have, you know, shifts in people writing, thinking, discussing. You know, a lot of the changes that we've seen in society, you know, historically have come through people having the ability to learn and question and read and write and explore new ideas. And so, yeah, I think that it's just, unfortunately, takes a very long time, which is not great.
And the reverse of that is true as well. That's why it was such a concerted effort to keep slaves uneducated, because an educated slave, I mean, it sounds almost weird to say, but is dangerous to the social order, because they realize and can have dialogue about, you know, how the oppression that they're experiencing and take action on account of it. So that's why education is in effect a revolutionary act and always has been. And I'm happy to be part of that revolution. I mean, I think we need to think of ourselves as being in the forefront of trying to make the world a better place. I mean, you know, that's really what it comes down to.
I mean, absolutely. And you know, again, you look at, you know, the template for any dictator coming in, they will attack the teachers, they will attack the universities, because they do not want an educated population. An educated population is one that might question. Exactly your point, Tony. Yeah.
Reminds me, my favorite quote about education that I've ever read was from Hannah Arendt, the German philosopher, who talked about education being the point at which you have to decide if you love the world enough to take responsibility for it, which I think speaks to a lot of what you're saying. So really like what you were saying before, Tony, about, you know, there will be some institutions or some systems or some individuals who are able to embrace or lean into this moment of change, and they're the people to work with, and, you know, that's where the network and the new movements can begin from. There've been a number of questions that are kind of riffing on that idea about how do we identify and find the like-minded individuals and institutions. Yeah. I wondered, you know, have you seen an increase in interest in schools wanting to join the different networks that Asia Society runs over the last year?
I mean, it's a little bit difficult now because, you know, COVID has sort of disrupted everything. So I don't know if we can use that as a barometer. But I will say, though, that I think one of the differences, in effect, this time, as we think about reform and change, is I do think we need to realize that it's not just about changing education systems, and particularly sort of from a technical sense. It is about creating the social movement within which change in education is both leading and swept up in. But I mean, and I mean, to the point you're saying that you know, if left by, you know, chance, there will be some who go forward and some who don't. That's essentially what we have right now in education in the Eastern United States. You have pockets of incredibly innovative places. I mean, you know, High Tech High, some of our schools, International Study Schools Network, these are phenomenal places that we would absolutely want to send our kids to go to. I'm sure every one of the Montessori schools is like that as well. but they still wind up being sort of these blips on the ocean, blips on the screen, and not the sort of full wave that needs to happen. So I do think some consideration by those of us who are advocating all this stuff is how do we actually use what we're talking about to engage people outside of education who will, in effect, create a different demand structure for what we want from education systems. And so I think, you know, that's part of the challenge, is how do we actually make this not about education reform, but about social movements towards societal reform.
Mm.
Does your Global Education Centre work in that way, or is it beginning to work in that way and kind of look for alliances and partnerships outside of the education sphere?
We haven't as yet, as much as I think we would like to. I mean, I probably Leonor may have a different experience, but I mean, this kind of references the first point you made about how this last 15 months has been a time, I think, of awakening understandings of what needs to happen. And so this sort of, what I'm talking about is sort of, at least from my perspective, where I'm headed, where I'm thinking going forward. And to the extent that I can bring my institution forward along those lines, that's great. I mean, it's not as though there's dissonance within the way we think, but this is the beginnings of what we're talking about, as opposed to something that's actually been happening for a long time. At least that's my perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, certainly from our perspective, you're right. You know, in Montessori we see this quite a lot, that there's all kind of people are already there. What I would say is, you know, is let's not forget we have allies in families. You know, how do we bring families along? Because they are the ones that will reinforce those messages within the home as well. They are the ones that will advocate, you know, parents will advocate for change in education if they feel that, you know, somehow their children are going to be disadvantaged, you know, in the future if they don't have those skills that are going to be needed. So I think we have to sort of widen the conversation outside of the education sphere to say, actually, education is everybody's responsibility. It's not just, and I think there's a certain, you know, I get this, that almost there's a sort of a mindset that says, oh yes, you are teachers, you are there, that is your responsibility, and your education is your responsibility. Well, actually, education is everybody's responsibility. And I think it's you know, we may have to start small. You know, Montessori talked about the triangle where the child is at the top and you've got the family, the community, and the school. And I think we have to say, actually, yes, we all have to, let's start with those communities, and then, you know, get everybody talking about responsibility. And I like what Tony said, it's a force for social change. It's about social change. It's not something that happens in a building somewhere that, you know, you take your child to and go, you know, pick it up afterwards. So I think we need to kind of spread that conversation wider.
You could definitely, I think, argue that there's never been a better time in the last 100 years than now to engage families, because parents have been so much more directly involved in their children's education over the last 12 months because of so much homeschooling going on, you know, and whether that's done in a digital environment, whether it's other manifestations of remote learning, the parents have witnessed the complexity of you know, of the education process for their children in ways that they wouldn't have done before.
The one thing I might add about that is, I mean, I think I sort of try to think of this from a strategic point of view, and I think, frankly, sustainability and you know, the perilousness of our environment and the sort of daily occurrences of things that make us think that something really bad is about to happen, and we need to do something about it. I think from a strategic point of view, that is going to be a really incredibly important sort of driver of change in thinking, because just speaking as a person of color in the United States, as much as we have been striving for equality, that hasn't caught on, to be honest with you, as the motivating factor for deep social change in this country. There has been so much resistance, and there continues to be. I do think, though, that the notion of environmental sustainability and environmental justice is or is just as much and maybe more kind of in everybody's home kind of concern, that strategically the alliance between concern around human equality and and sort of in balance with nature is going to be the way in which we actually begin to create a social movement around these kinds of things. Because you know, I as much as I would have loved to have said that the United States has risen up towards, you know, greater equality for every person, hadn't happened in the last 400 years. I'm not going to wait for, you know, it happened in another 400. So where can we find allies that actually are going to help us make both of those things happen? So I think we have to think strategically about it as people who are thinking about social movements, to where are the allyships, where are the allegiances, where are the understandings of the systemic root causes for both issues that we can focus on and have that be the basis for a big social movement, as opposed to a more particularized movement within certain sectors.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, that it's an issue you know, I've been reflecting a lot about this, because obviously, you know, sustainability and teaching about children about the respect for the world around you is a very big part of what we do. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and my thinking is that, you know, perhaps we need to slightly change the language around this, because it is actually something that affects everybody. You know, what I'm not seeing, and what I'm not seeing reported, and it may be a media issue, is around, okay, what does sustainability mean for food production? You know, how are you going to feed your family if there's a drought? You know, what does that mean? We talk, sometimes we run the risk of talking in abstract about, you know, climate change. And it's such a big topic that people almost like think, oh, it's got nothing to do with me. But I was very struck, and it was quite interesting. I was talking to a gardener, someone who I'm currently in a house in rural Croatia. And they were saying, yes, you know, climate change, we're not having so much snow in the winter. And we live in a place where the earth is clay. And that means that instead of having snow, we have rain. And the rain stays on top of the soil. It doesn't go down to the water table. So we're having difficulty growing our crops. And you just, so for that person who was not what we would call traditionally educated person, but someone who, climate change was a really real issue. He understood it. He understood it at that level. This is happening, and therefore I cannot grow crops. And I think there's something about, you know, how do we talk about it? How do we make it really real to people and make it tangible? That if you don't talk about these issues, if we don't talk about equality, if we don't talk about, you know, climate change, if we don't talk about these issues, you know, this is going to actually have a very direct effect. And Tony, what you were saying, this is going to have a direct effect on your child's ability to feed itself as it grows up to be an adult. Mm-hmm. You know, it's almost kind of as basic as that. You know, if your child is unable to find work, or if your child is unable to support itself as an adult, what does it mean? You know, what does it mean? What are you going to do? You know, what are you going to do for your child now to stop that from happening? So I think there's something about, you know, and I think the article that you wrote, Tony, was really powerful about that, because I think it kind of brought home to me about that immediacy of this actually has a really significant, tangible impact on people's lives, and we're not necessarily seeing that in the conversations that are being had.
Within the Montessori classroom, or the Montessori approach, then do your teachers have specific strategies for engaging? Or you talked earlier, and there's a good question about this as well, about you know, when children make an inappropriate comment in the classroom, there's a way of kind of handling that situation.
Yeah. So first of all, we don't, you know, what we don't do, as I think I said before, is we don't say, oh no, that's terrible, you shouldn't have done that, you know, because immediately, and we all know this as human beings, immediately somebody tells you you've done something wrong, your defenses go up. You're like, okay, you know, because it's human nature. We do is we sit down and we talk about it. And so we say, right, okay, well, why did you say that? You know, what do you think it, you know, what do you think the impact is of that? And it's the same in terms of what we talk about sustainability. You know, we encourage children to grow things, because that's the way they learn that actually if you don't put water into the ground, the plant doesn't grow. So, you know, well, what happens if there's no rain? The plant won't grow. You know, so where does the water come from? You know, where so you sort of are able to have quite, you know, one of the things that people, you know, often sort of comment on is that we have quite kind of mature conversations with children. We don't dumb things down. You know, we have mature conversations because children have the capacity to understand quite sort of, if you explain it in the right way, quite important concepts. And I think that, and we back that up through tangible activities to sort of reinforce that learning of saying, well, look, this is the impact of this. So that's some of the things that how we, some of the techniques that we use.
There are really interesting cluster of questions around teacher training and resources for teachers. And it's a kind of common thread. People talking about teachers they know who want to embrace these kind of strategies or adopt these kind of approaches in their classrooms, but it's difficult to do that when the rest of the school isn't, or the rest of the system isn't necessarily. And I wondered, with both Asia Society and Montessori, you have teacher education programs, don't you? And are there resources that people can access for free, or are they paid for courses? Or could you each say a little bit more about that?
Very quickly, because I think we're running out of time. Yeah, we do. I mean, there's lots of resources. If I think at some point we might or could now put the link to the Center for Global Education's website, but it's essentially the Center for Global Education at Asia Society. And there are a number of resources. I mean, what we do in terms of teacher training is essentially provide resources and training that allows teachers to teach the content that they already are assigned to teach, but teach it in a different way, and teach it in a way that embraces assessment that has more to do with sort of allowing young children to show what they know through performance-based assessment, and also engaging young people in learning content in the context of a project that actually is focused on an important topic or an issue, and particularly with the Sustainable Development Goals as the basis for some of those kind of projects. So we have a whole system and set of resources that are about helping teachers not add on something to the curriculum, but actually take the curriculum and do it in a different way that's more engaging, which is incredibly important, the engagement factor, the motivation factor for young people. Teach it in a way that's more engaging, and teach it in a way that young people have an opportunity to both show what they know in a demonstration of understanding, but then use that as a basis then for taking action on that issue. So oftentimes the lesson ends, but the learning and the action around it continues after what we do. So yes, the answer is that has been the focus of what we've done.
And at Montessori, we do have the Montessori Network, which is a free online resource for anybody who's interested in Montessori, but whether it's families or practitioners or educators. We do have more formal training, which is paid for, but we do offer bursaries for those who come from backgrounds where it may be an issue or maybe a barrier to come to more paid training. So we do support that.
Fantastic. We're almost at the hour, so thank you both ever so much. It's been fantastic to listen to the two of you talk. I hope there'll be many other opportunities when the two of you come together and talk in public, because
I'd love to.
Really interesting.
Been fun, yeah.
And this idea that we are at a kind of moment of inflection or a pivot point, and there's an opportunity to do an awful lot of good or address a lot of historic harm, starting with education reform. Jennifer, if I hand back to you to close us out, if that's okay.
Yes, great, Dominic, Leonor, and Tony, thank you so much for this session. I think it's really inspiring to hear different organizations that are global and trying to help us have good things happening in our education systems and beyond. Sometimes I think we in the education sector, we feel a little bit like we're pounding at this ourselves, and to know that this needs to be pushed out to more of a societal effort, I think is really great for us to hear as well. Tony, you mentioned something where you talked about, and the reason why I'm mentioning this is because every single one of these sessions, regardless of the topic, it comes down to kind of a key message. We know that teachers and principals in schools, they're given a curriculum from their ministries of education, their departments of education, their national departments of education. So they're given a curriculum. But the messaging that we hear in all of these sessions is that it's how they do the curriculum. They have, as individual teachers, they've got great power and influence in the pedagogical approaches that they use. And those pedagogical approaches, if they engage the students and compel them and motivate them to action, that's where we're going to have a change in our education system. So thank you, Tony and Leonor. You really reinforced those points, and I think that's really helpful. Just to close off, a reminder that all of you are welcome to join this portal, knowledgehook.com/leadership. And again, it's free resources, and some of those roundtables that I was mentioning, they're all available on demand. And finally, just to give you a sense of next steps, our next roundtable is going to be on Thursday, April the 22nd at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this time we're looking at things from a parent's point of view, children's mental health and well-being. And we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to be bringing in 3 parenting experts, 2 from Toronto, Canada, and 1 from San Diego, California. And they're going to talk to us about what they're hearing from parents and how can we as educators work with our parents to really focus on children's mental health and well-being in that partnership way. So please, I think the registration is open now, so feel free to jump on. And finally, thank you, Leonor, Tony, and Dominic. This has been an incredible session. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and see you next time.